The views and opinions on Where Did the Road Go belong to those making them. Do not mistake allowing freedom of speech for agreement. This month's Where Did the Road Go is sponsored by the following amazing individuals: Greg Ross, Bill Illuminati, Allison Cook, No One, Yvonne Williams, Super Inframan, 36 Dingo, and Michael Frisky. Thank you all for helping to make this show possible. And if you'd like to help out, become a patron at wheredidtheroadgo.com. It's only $3 a month for lots of extra content.
Transmission start. Welcome to Where Did the Road Go? Join us as we wander off the path and explore lost history, consciousness, the paranormal, unexplained mysteries, alternative thought, and much more. We are present on the web at wheredidtheroadgo.com. Now here is your host, Seriah.
Welcome to this edition of Where Did the Road Go? And tonight I have back Mr. Marty Garza.
Hello. How you doing, Seriah?
I am doing okay. How are you doing?
I guess I'm doing well, all things considered.
Yes. You've had a rough summer. Summer?
Yeah. Past few months have been a little rough. little bit of hardship in my life, but keeping my head up and moving forward.
And you are, I guess people put you in the paranormal spotlight because of your appearances on Brothers of the Serpent.
Yeah, I mean, I've been involved in researching the UFO phenomenon for most of my life, which is quite a number of decades at this point. But it was in recent years where I started opening or broadening my horizons a little bit and recognizing that there was a lot more to the phenomenon than nuts and bolts UFOs, and started researching more of the paranormal side of the phenomenon and trying to make connections between all these different things, see if I could recognize maybe formerly unrecognized patterns.
Yeah. And that's that. And you've done a good job of that, honestly. Like early on, even when I was still in the nuts and bolts camp, I can't remember. I dropped the nuts and bolts thing after reading Project Omega from Kenneth Ring, where he showed the after effects of UFO interactions and near-death experiences were almost identical. And it just broke me. I was like, wait, how is aliens and death, having the same effect on people? And I'm like, oh, maybe now I understand what Vallee was saying. Okay, they're not necessarily aliens.
Yeah, I think that entire aspect of the phenomenon was suppressed for a long time because they were dealing with something that was already generally unaccepted. Obviously in recent years it has become far more mainstream than it once was. But early on, the idea of saying that you had seen something in the sky or had encountered some type of a craft or something, that was quite a stretch for most people. And then the idea of introducing these truly bizarre aspects where, voices or apparitions in your home and things like that, that was just a bridge too far for most people. So I can understand the reluctance. And, it was J. Allen Hynek who really started writing about that and recognizing that a sizable percentage of information was being filtered out, not only at a high level, but even at the entry level. Like, he wrote about the fact that most people that would, let's say you're talking in the 50s or 60s and somebody had an encounter, their first, reaction would be, let's say, to call the police.
Yeah.
Well, very often, if the reports were truly strange, the police would just say, "Oh, there's some whack job that is calling, made up a story, is probably on drugs or something," and they just ignore it, throw the report in the trash. And it was only the ones that were, in their mind thinking, "Oh, well, that sounds more, along the lines of what we've heard before. Oh, they saw a flying disc or something like that." Those reports would be forwarded to the Air Force and then to Blue Book or whatever. But a whole lot of data was lost in that filtering of the phenomenon. And I think as a result, it's like the public was almost conditioned to view the phenomenon, or the UFO phenomenon, in a very narrow. They were like looking at this through a keyhole. They were only looking at a very small percentage of the data. And I think that now we're trying to dig ourselves out of that hole and say, look, you've got to recognize these other really strange things that surround these, that it's, unexplainable things, like, where you have, even, in more modern sightings or encounters, like such as like the Nimitz encounter, where you have like Kevin Day, who was operating the radar that directed the aircraft to go, intercept this, Tic Tac or whatever. And he claims that he had paranormal effects from that. Yeah. Watching this thing through binoculars, he ended up getting this hitchhiker effect thing, and of course, we take that for what it's worth. And I'm going to caveat this, like always, in almost all of my appearances on everything, I always give like a disclaimer that for me, and I think it's really important for people to understand where I come from, that I try not to make judgment calls on things in terms of being on one side of the fence or the other, in terms of how I might interpret cases or individuals, or whatever you want to, whatever aspect of the phenomenon we're dealing with. I view it all as data, and I try not to necessarily make judgment calls like at face value. I recognize that there's ambiguity in almost all of the data, right, and there's always going to be a counter argument to everything. So I just look at it like in the broad scheme of things. Here's a report, and this is what the individual involved claims to have experienced. And I just say, well, how does that line up versus the experiences of other individuals historically, not just, 2004 through today? How does this compare against people going back to, the beginning of the, 20th century? And how does that compare against people in the 15th century? And how does that compare against people, around, 2,500, 3,500 years ago? Those kind of things mean a lot more to me.
So there's like three different directions I want to go with this. The hitchhiker effect thing, as you're saying, though, I wonder if the thing has to be necessarily paranormal, or if it's something that affects you in a way that broadens your mind, that you're now able to experience some of these other phenomena. So let's say the Tic Tac was just a test craft, or like plasma technology or something. But he saw that, and now he's like, oh, weird stuff does exist. I just witnessed it. And now his subconscious is a little more open to letting that data kind of filter through.
It could be, I try, this is another one of, things that I say on the other, on the Brothers of Serpent show quite often, is that I try not to boil down things down to like binary choices. Yes, no, real, not real, those kind of things.
Sure.
I always try to look like, well, what are the other possibilities? And one thing that is not I would say is not off the table, and this, I'm saying this from a historical perspective, that it is possible that it can be a both and like thing, where theoretically the Tic Tac could be a man-made craft of some sort, but the propulsion system that it uses could create paranormal effects. In other words, it can be both. It doesn't have to be one or the other. And I will refer to the Bell, the Nazi Bell Project as an example of something along those lines, that it appeared, if the reports are true, if any of the lore surrounding it is true, it appears that it was a mechanism, not necessarily a flying machine like what most people tend to gravitate towards. It could have been a power generation, or it could have had all sorts of different uses. It doesn't have to be a flying machine. It could be one component of a bigger program. But the paranormal effects surrounding it appear to have been like a byproduct.
Yeah.
And I think that there are other examples of that in more modern history.
Yeah, I wasn't trying to nail it down to a binary. I'm just saying, like, if it was one thing, I mean, like, the fact that it's a hitchhiker effect doesn't necessarily mean the event was paranormal. It could be, and what you're saying is dead on. I mean, it could be, and it could be both. But continue. Other examples in history?
Yeah, I mean, there have been other reports of people who have experienced physiological effects. For example, you know, that one of the things that, you know, everybody has been referring to Garry Nolan recently is his disclosure of the cases where there was physiological effects to the brains of certain individuals as a result of encounters and those kind of things. And those effects, which it's unclear at this point whether these were as a result of their encounter or whether these were pre-existing conditions that lend themselves to the experience. In other words, it could be the other way around.
Right.
It's hard to say with the amount of data that, you know, the amount of information that we've been given. It's not clear which way that is. I've heard it explained both ways, so it's hard to say. But I think there's an example of this like overlap between the physical encounter of, you know, some type of a structured craft that then has all these different paranormal effects that people tend to at that point receive downloads, or they have premonitions. They have all these, you know, things that we would historically associate with more paranormal type stuff, you know, shadow beings in their home and those kind of things.
And those are definitely the things that people would leave out at one point. Like I've heard, even today, I still hear people say things like, well, you know, if people have more than one experience, I tend not to believe them. And it's like, but that's the norm. Like, most people don't have just one experience. Some people do. But I find that you have that type of person who, you know, like once you've had an experience, it kind of opens you up to other experiences. So whatever this stuff is, it kind of has an effect on us. Yeah, definitely. I think that there are different mechanisms for this, I believe. I think that trauma has some effect on people. It's for some reason, it seems to pierce that veil, and it lends that individual's perception to be able to you know, just recognize things that might have always been there but just didn't register. Yeah. In other words, I don't know that it's necessarily like all of a sudden creates a magnet. In other words, imagine you have an individual that had never had any sort of experience, and then all of a sudden one day they come around a corner and there's a craft in the middle of the road. And then from that point on, they're seeing things in their home or hearing, you know, getting downloads of information. I don't know that it necessarily works that way. It could be that those things were happening all along. They just could not perceive them. And that encounter, that initial traumatic experience cracked the egg. And now they can see things that were there all along. They just couldn't perceive it. Well, one of the things I tend to focus on is how we perceive reality. And have you read The Invisible Gorilla? I'm familiar with the concept of what that is, but I haven't read it. I know what the premise is. The book is incredible because they do all these various tests on just how we perceive reality. And our brain is a filter. It filters out 90% of what's going on, maybe 99% of what's going on around us. It decides what's important. So that's what I was saying with like the Tic Tac guy there. It might be that up to that point, his brain was like, this stuff isn't real, I'm filtering it out. And then he sees this Tic Tac, and regardless of what it was, his brain's like, oh, maybe this other weird stuff is real too. Maybe I should let him know about this. Yeah, you know, and there's two different ways to look at this. And I find myself debating, and I think this is another one of those things where it's an and, it's not an it or it's an also. Yes, and a lot of this stuff is. There's no doubt that there is a perceptual problem in terms of how we perceive the phenomenon, right? I think that people will interpret things in different ways. So that's definitely one aspect. But at the same time, I think that there are historical examples that suggest that there is also an active mechanism. In other words, the phenomenon has the ability to change how we perceive it. It's not just our perception. It's like we're actively being jammed. Yeah. And I heard like a recent example that I heard of this, and I believe we've discussed Rey Hernandez's case, the gentleman who his wife and he experienced an apparition in their home, and his wife interpreted it as an angel. He interpreted it as some type of a mechanical object, and all. But he tells a story. I saw an interview with him recently where he described going outside of his house, and he was a total skeptic. He was a tax attorney, total skeptic his whole life, and
after these experiences, he started to perceive things differently, obviously. And he said one day he went outside his home with his daughter and his two neighbors came over, and he actively called a UFO to appear. And he said within 15 minutes, this giant disc appears over them. Mm. They all see it. And he thinks to himself, come on, is that the best you can do type thing? Like, this is bullshit. I want to see something, more significant. And he said it disappeared and changed into something else. And the other people saw it too. So in other words, it's not like it's strictly his perception.
Right. Oh, yeah, yeah.
It was reacting to his expectation and to his internal, it's a two-way street there. It's not strictly a misinterpretation of what you're seeing, because like you said, our brain is definitely a filter. It filters out 99% of what our sensory input, brings in. But keep in mind, our sensors are only able to perceive a very, very small spectrum of what's actually out there. So in other words, we're probably perceiving 1% of all the things that are going on around us at any given point.
And you get that when you have animals reacting to things that you can't see. It's like why is the dog staring and barking at that spot in the living room? What's he seeing?
That's another example of how, for people that suggest that these are egregores or something along those lines, you have to recognize that it's not just our perception. There are other things around. It's like when they start affecting radar systems and different types of sensors like that, or animals. That is an indication that there truly is something there. It's not something we are fabricating in our mind. Yeah. It's not a shadow. It's not our own. It's not our own shadow. It is something genuinely there.
I think the problem with this stuff is that for most of our history, people have tried to force it into one box or another. So, if you see Bigfoot, well, it's an ape in the woods. That's the only option. It either doesn't exist or it's an ape in the woods. If you see a UFO, it's either space aliens or it doesn't exist. And I think this stuff is incredibly complicated. And I think, the way we perceive things is incredibly complicated. And there are so many things outside of our perception. And then if you bring into it stuff like, what you can call poltergeist energy or psychokinetic energy that certain locations could have, or that we may be putting out there that things can use. I mean, the book I'm working on that's not my autobiography is trying to look at each of these phenomena in as many different ways as possible. And it's not that I'm saying it's one thing or another. I'm literally saying all of these are probably true to explain some of this stuff. And there's probably a ton of stuff we can't even think of just because we have never had the perspective on it to even think of some ideas, and hopefully, the better questions we ask about it, someone will come up with better questions eventually.
Yeah, I think that the phenomenon exploits that. I think it recognizes our tendency to see patterns, and it will mimic our expectation. In other words, it'll...
Yes, yeah.
And that's why, I've commented recently how we're starting to see a lot of discussion about AI, that this is now most likely some form of AI that we're in contact with. And I'm like, that's just the next version of the airships of the 1800s or the flying shields of 1500. Right. Yet it's just that's where our technology is, and so that's the way we're going to perceive this.
It's where our technology is going, so that's where we're going to perceive it.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I bet you AI's. I have a feeling it's been around longer than what people realize. It's like drones. Drones have been around way longer than what we realize. But the Nazis were working on drones. Of course, they were wired drones, but they were working on drones in World War II.
Yeah, well, drones definitely, and versions of AI. But the thing is, none of it's really true intelligence is the problem. I mean, we talk about it like it's intelligent in some way, but it's just algorithms that can build upon information. It's not doing anything novel. It's not actually thinking.
Yeah, I agree with that. But I think that odds are that state of the art in that is probably more advanced than what we're privy to.
True, but I don't know if we'll ever be able to replicate with electronics what's biological. Like the system would have to be so complex.
Oh yeah, but I believe that even biology could be a technology.
Okay, that's fair. That's fair.
Yeah, if you look at, our composition, if you look at cells,
Yeah,
they're
no,
little
you're right.
machines. They're
Yeah.
machines made up of machines. And so I think that it could be somebody's technology. Just it's so advanced that we're not even capable of recognizing it.
Well, you just recognized it.
Well, because we're getting to that point where we can see down to that level, and we're starting. Of course, every time we make a new discovery, it just of course creates a ton of new questions, and we're just getting further and further away from the ultimate answers. You know what I mean?
Well, maybe. I like I said, I think this stuff is so complex, and we're not thinking of it in a wide enough view. Like, we call this stuff paranormal or supernatural, and I forget who it was, said that this is rare phenomena. It's not outside the norm, it's just rare. And I went, oh, that's perfect. Because it is. It kind of seamlessly blends into reality. It just doesn't happen, as often as it rains or the sun rises. It's something that only happens once in a while, and as Jeffrey Kripal pointed out, tends to happen when we need it most in our lives, like when it has a really impactful moment in our lives.
Yeah, I totally see that, but I also believe that it is not out of the realm of possibility that we can't see the forest from the trees. That this phenomenon is with us. It's so pervasive that we actually cannot make a distinction between it and our normal reality. Like,
you have an airplane starting up over there.
What's that? You
have an airplane starting up over there.
Yeah, it's my hard drive, or I think it's actually the fan on my hard drive. For example, things that we would consider like our conscience.
Yeah.
Could we really tell if it wasn't our conscience?
True.
You know what I mean? It could be that that's just something that we've always had, so we don't ever view it as being something potentially external to us. And I'm not saying that is the case, but there are historical examples that would suggest that. And I've found, and this is a couple of different points, but I know that I have experienced this myself in terms of I've been in situations where things have happened that I feel like I was assisted.
Yes.
And this was clearly beyond a shadow of a doubt external. And I can say also that, and I'm sure you deal with this quite a bit, in private conversation, I will just routinely hear the words, I've never told anybody this, but
yeah.
I hear that all the time. And that kind of leads me to, Vallee's, and we may have discussed this in the past, but Vallee's hilltop graph, where he kind of graphs out how there will be people that, let's say, have an encounter. Let's say they step outside and they see a strange light in the sky type. Odds are they won't ever mention that to anybody. Like it hardly registers to themselves, right?
Right.
It's just a curiosity. Then you have the person that steps out and might see an actual structured object in the sky, and that was kind of important. It was significant. So they'll tell their family, maybe like their immediate family or close friends. Then you get a next level where there might have been a more significant case where, they see an object land somewhere or something where they feel compelled to report it to, the police or, a UFO reporting center or something like that. And then as these encounters get weirder, you start going up the scale of reportability. But once they get truly weird, they kind of drop off the other side. And now you increasingly are less like when people start saying, well, I saw a craft and there were these weird looking beings and then they showed up in my bedroom. And as you crest that, the likelihood of the reports start dropping off. And the weirder they get, the less likely they are to report it. And it gets to the point where a lot of these people won't even tell their own immediate family.
Yeah, they don't want them to think they're crazy.
Yeah. So I don't know that it could be definitively stated that these are unusual events or rare events. I have this sneaking suspicion that they're far more common than what most people would even admit to themselves.
That's also a valid point. They're far more common than, for instance, being struck by lightning or seeing a shooting star, or but what I'm saying though is they're not outside our reality in a sense. They're not. Maybe terms like supernatural and paranormal put them in a way of looking at them where they don't belong. they're actually integrated very well into our reality. We just always don't acknowledge or see them, or as you say, talk about them if we do.
Yeah, I think that the strange, kind of the strangeness of the encounters is like it's a feature, not a bug.
Yeah, yeah.
In the last episode, I'm trying to pull up a quote right here, so it takes me a second here. But I don't think it was not the last episode, but we've got this series called "The Spookiest Story Never Told" that we've been going through, and in this, we cover a lot of different aspects of the phenomenon, and it's a really unusual take. I think it's, I often caveat, like I'll say this episode is not going to have anything whatsoever to do with UFOs.
Yeah, yeah.
But in a way it does, and I mentioned a quote by a gentleman named Geronimo Cardono, and he was a really, really brilliant guy. Who many people have probably, or some people that are, very well versed in ufology may have heard of his father, Fazio Cardono, because he had a fairly well-known encounter with some beings that are more typically referred to as demons. But it's lesser known as that his son, Geronimo, who was actually far more accomplished. He had an entire lifetime of very strange encounters, and he was a brilliant mathematician. He was considered the best doctor in the world at one point. He was the first diagnostician, and he even said that it was not due to any of his study. He said it was some form of gift that he didn't know where it came from. And he made some really interesting observations, and this was, in the late 1500s when he lived, and he made some statements that could be pulled out of like modern day ufology. But one of his really good ones, I'm going to read this quote. He said, "Yet such unnatural occurrences have this effect, that while they are in the very act of happening, or shortly before they come to pass, they make such a great impression on a man, engaging his whole attention. When, however, the first heat of their influence has grown cool, and the effect is diluted, unless you have made sure of their reality by nailing them, as it were, upon your consciousness, you almost doubt whether you have actually seen or heard anything. And this, I believe, happens for reasons even deeper than the gulf between our own. For in the mind, which is neither paralyzed by fear nor unsettled by conflicting emotions, violent spiritual stimuli, accompanied by demonstrations of a miraculous nature, undermine the foundations of false notions rather than increasing them."
And that is definitely a thing. Like, you have these experiences, and if they're intense enough, you have no doubt about them. But sometimes they're subtle enough where you're going, over time, maybe I imagined it. Maybe it wasn't, I don't know, like you start to, the doubts start to creep in.
Why do UFOs have lights on them? Why would a gnome or a fairy appear to a person, or it sounds absurd?
Yeah.
And the absurdity is the point.
Yep.
It's the absurdity is the thing that nails it to your consciousness.
It's almost like dream language too.
Yeah, I think that the fact that presentation, that manifestation in a form that is out of normal reality emphasizes the importance of this encounter. Something is happening that you need to pay attention to, but it's not. It's almost to the point where you don't know if it really happened, but at the same time, you know it was important.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there are experiences I had where I know they happened, and I know they were weird, and I have no doubts about them. And then there are others where I'm like, I don't know. I mean, at the time I was sure, but now I'm kind of like, maybe I didn't see that quite like I thought I did. Like there was a grotesque monkey I watched walk out of the field in the back, and it was dark out, and there was a little bit of wind. There was an very oppressive feeling in the air. And like over time, I convinced myself it was probably just matrixing, because it kind of walked out of the field and disappeared. And I'm like, it was just the corn moving in the dark. But I had that weird oppressive feeling, But it wasn't till I looked at the stuff that happened around it, and it was surrounded by a bunch of stuff that I know happened, and I'm going, maybe I did see a grotesque monkey apparition. Now I'm not sure. Because on its own, it's easy enough to dismiss, but when you're looking at it in the context of the other stuff happening around it, and it all kind of connects, it's like, okay, so maybe that was something.
Another point I think that's important, and this is kind of a multifaceted point. And I'll see if I can make this somewhat understandable in the way my brain puts things together. There is the tendency to take things at face value, especially related to the phenomenon, and people will look at it from one level and say, oh, the phenomenon does this, UFOs do this, so we can extrapolate that this is their purpose or their intent.
Right.
And as you pull back and you start looking at it from a higher level and you start taking in more data, you see that maybe it might look that way when you're looking at it, up close. But as you pull back, you start to bring in more data and you realize that, well, this appears to be a pattern of conduct that's not always what it appears to be. And there are consistencies, and related to that, a prominent ufologist, very high profile, that's held in very high regard. And honestly, I have quite a bit of respect for his knowledge on things. Historical, I'm historical. When I say historical, I mean like 40s to today cases and stuff. But he recently disputed the idea that the phenomenon was very old. He thinks that it's a relatively recent, thing that post nuclear age. He falls into the camp that the test at Trinity or the use of nuclear weapons is what all of a sudden spurred, an interest by some alien intelligence to come, check us out. And I take exception to that view. And his argument was like, oh, well, people are just misinterpreting what people said in the past, or they, the way they used their language did not translate well. He's using basically like the skeptic's arguments against all these things. So I purposely look for accounts that are more specific. And just because I had this up, there's an author named Robert Burton that in 1621, he wrote a book called The Anatomy of Melancholy. And he makes a lot of really good observations too. And he's talking about these types of encounters. And he says that, and again, you got to realize that, we're using labels, right? They didn't, this was a different age. It wasn't a technological age like we have today. So the labels they might use to describe these things might be slightly different, but the description is what's most important. He says in this book, aerial spirits or devils are such as keep quarter in the air for the most part. They can assume other aerial bodies, all manners of shapes, and at their pleasure, appear in the likeness that they will themselves, and are most swift in motion, can pass many miles in an instant, and so likewise transform their bodies into whatever shape they please, with admirable swiftness. Remove them from place to place, and can represent castles in the air, palaces, armies, spectrums, prodigies, or other strange objects to mortal men's eyes. Cause men's eyes to swell, savors, deceive all senses. Most writers credibly believe of the subject credibly believe. They can foretell future events and do many strange miracles.
Yeah, that sounds like the UFO phenomena.
Yeah, he says these most erroneous paradoxes rejected by our divines and Christian churches. 'Tis true they have by God's permission power over us, and we find by experience that they can hurt not only our fields and cattle and goods, but our bodies and minds. Many times men are frighted out of their wits, carried away quite, and severely molested by his means. Like he's describing crop circles, cattle mutilations.
Right. Potentially.
Instantaneous movements, abductions, I find it hard to believe that there could be a different interpretation.
Although I don't know, there are so many people who will argue that there are no real crop circles. I mean, there's definitely saucer nests, which, is where they supposedly got the inspiration for making crop circles. So I'm very ambiguous when it comes to the whole crop circle thing at this point.
Right. Well, whatever is causing, by whatever means these things are happening, I just find it interesting that, half a millennia ago, they were describing things that are so similar to what we experience now. Yeah. And they also, the suggestion is that the idea that this might be the result of some form of extraterrestrial intelligence or non-human intelligence, that this is a product of the science fiction age.
Yeah.
They were talking about intelligences from out in, what did they call it? Superlunar intelligences. In other words, things from out beyond the moon.
Yeah.
Back then, so that can be, that fallacy can easily be dispelled. They were already talking about this 500, 600 years ago.
So what do you think of the whole ancient alien idea?
I think we get into like a dispute over semantics.
Okay.
That it depends on how you would interpret the term alien. It comes down to that. And I've said before, is it ancient aliens or is it always aliens? It's like, it's not, you know what I mean? It can be both again. In other words, that intelligences or an intelligence of some cumulative intelligence that is all there is. In other words, some like Akashic record type thing we could be in the middle of an intelligence field that is almost hidden to us, but yet on rare or possibly rare occasion we have access to. And this intelligence may have the ability to manifest in physical reality. If we can conceive of ways of doing this, just imagine what a billion years from now we could do. In other words, granted, we would have to survive our own technological advancement, but
right.
That's a big hurdle for the I know that, one very popular interpretation is, future humans. Are we dealing with, ourselves from the future coming back? And I'm like, well, I'm not saying that's not possible, but just recognize there are a lot of assumptions in that. That we're assuming that we survive our own technological advancement. We're assuming that we don't get hit by a meteor, or a coronal mass ejection. And there's all sorts of things that could prevent that from ever happening unless we figure out how to detach our consciousness from our physical existence. Right? If those are two independent things, right, then the constraint comes off, because then you are talking all time. It's not future past. It's everything all at once, right? And that is could potentially be supported by the experiences or what we're told from the remote viewers, where when I say remote viewers, I'm not necessarily referring to, modern day like Stargate program type stuff. I'm talking remote viewing goes back thousands of years. That's used different terms, but the Sibyls going back 5,000 years were doing that.
Yes.
So, and you can call it astral travel or anything, but, again, it's semantics. They're talking about their consciousness leaving their physical body.
Yeah, and I've heard people, I've asked people that who are into the, remote viewing and stuff. It's like, what's the difference between astral travel and remote viewing? And the argument is, well, remote viewing, you're not leaving your body, you're seeing a distant place, whereas astral travel, you're leaving your body to see a distant place. But I don't know that there's any way we can know that either of those things are what's actually happening.
Yeah, and even the people in the program use different means, and their perception of the process was quite a bit different. Some believed that they were being informed by some external agent that was giving them the information, and others perceived as having that ability to detach from their physical self, and and then that has overlap into the the NDE stuff and. Yeah. And that's where, this stuff gets so complex that you can't take it all in one fell swoop. Like you cannot say, okay, we're gonna do an episode and we're gonna cover all of this paranormal stuff. It's like you're talking about covering so much ground, it's virtually impossible.
Yes. Yeah. So I remember Joe McMoneagle saying that he would get results like when he was driving to do a remote session, he would already be getting some of the results from the session he was going to be doing. I remember they're also saying that when the remote viewers were told, like, oh, this is what you were remote viewing, they were more accurate in their remote viewing than if they were never told what they were remote viewing.
Right. That led them to the theory that they were tapping into future knowledge.
Right.
Right. That reinforcement, being given that confirmation, is what allowed them to be able to make that prediction. Right.
Yep.
But if that's the case, because I mull this kind of thing over a lot, and I think about like, okay, now how would that apply to somebody like Nikola Tesla, for example, who describes effectively the same type of experience, but he is provided with information or accesses information that he could not know. In other words, like I guess the way I'm would try to explain this is in a normal design process of any sort of mechanical object, it's an evolutionary process. You create a prototype, you make improvements to that, and it's never right the first time. You go through various iterations until you finalize it and you reach a point where it's acceptable to perform the things that you intended, right? Well, Tesla skipped all that. He didn't have any sort of prototype. He would go into this state and would see the finished product.
Yeah.
And then come back and build it. I totally skipped all that. Like, well, if he was tapping into future knowledge, the prototyping still would have had to have occurred at some point for him to reach that. And I think that point might be even more definitive in cases of like, and I'm blanking out on some names, but we've covered some like mathematicians that have developed mathematical formulas that did not exist. So if they're tapping into future knowledge, well, where did they develop the formula? In other words, they would have had to have occurred at some point. It didn't just spontaneously appear out of nowhere.
Well, you're looking at retro-causality, so we that makes things complicated to begin with. And if we're not living in a world where there's free will, like if we're in a structured sort of thing, then it could pop up from nowhere, just going backwards. It
could pop up from nowhere from a localized standpoint. But that formula would have had to have existed or been developed somewhere, sometime, or even if it's out of time. It's just I don't have a term to describe it in a non-physical and physical space. That formula had to be a part of the geometry engineered into our reality, right? Mm-hmm. If our reality is a product and we reside within that, and all the mechanisms such as time and dimensionality, physical dimensions are all part of this mechanism, that still had to come from somewhere. And where somebody had to have written it or designed it in some way for that individual to then be able to access that information. That formula is in that mechanism somewhere. Again, it's the Akashic records for.
Yes, yeah, that's entirely possible. But again, the Akashic records could also be, again, if we're not, I don't know, the whole free will debate always interests me because there's really no way we can resolve it per se, but it opens different possibilities for different things. So like the fact that he came up with the formula, like it may have happened in the future first, like he manages to come up with the formula and then sends that information backwards to then come up with the formula, like a time loop, basically.
But if that's the case, if he never went through the prototyping process, then he changed the future.
Or that's just where but if it's static, then he didn't change the future. It just had to be there. And so he had to come up with it. So, it's like almost like bad programming, or a glitch in a TV show or movie where you're going, wait a minute, all right, whatever,
Right. This reverts back to, and I've used this quote recently because it's funny because I mentioned, we did a little thing on Discord last week and I mentioned that this was like my favorite John Anthony West quote. And everything kind of falls back on this. And he used to say, give me one free miracle and I can explain everything.
Yes. Oh yeah. Yeah.
That's exactly it. In other words, Yes, he's tapping, you're tapping into future knowledge, but that's the free miracle. You can't explain how that knowledge was derived. You can only explain from that moment forward.
I guess what I'm saying is that if our reality's static and we're just like living it out like a TV show, it might just be bad writing.
Yeah. I do believe that that at a certain level we have free will. But that is like predicated on the fact that all of our decisions are influenced by our experience. So we do things that are beyond our will all the time. Sometimes you're like, I really shouldn't, have that eighth drink, right? I know better than that, but you do it anyway. Or
yes.
Maybe I shouldn't have all those tequila shots.
And I mean, I've gotten to the point where I think I know myself well enough to know what I will and won't do. It's like, oh yeah, I should do this. I know I'm not going to.
Right.
I'm not going to even go through the motions because I'm not going to keep it up.
Yeah. I run into mental blocks all the time. Like I know that there is something that is within my capability, but my brain gets in the way. Like I won't do something just because like I run through all these scenarios in my mind of everything that can go wrong. So I said, no, it's not worth it. Type thing, So I think that's sort of an example of what I mean, that we're heavily influenced by our experience and our imagination. Like and that's probably a self-preservation mechanism that we either developed or tapped into future knowledge to derive. I don't know, but somehow or another we are always influenced by our own subconscious. That, like I said, it's not always as straightforward as free will. Like I have the will to do this. Like
yeah. Yeah, but I don't know. I feel like the way I generally lean is that we're on sort of a river, and we can't really change the course of the river, but we can change how we react to things on the river and how much time we spend at the side of the river trying to figure out what we want to do. When in reality, we have only one path to travel.
That is really close to an analogy that I've used also. I present this as a hypothetical scenario that the phenomenon, if the phenomenon truly does, and this is a debatable point, but if the phenomenon does have some objective or some reason to care or about us as an individual, because that's another big mystery, is why some intelligence from some very distant solar system, billions of light years away or whatever, cares about a particular human, like not just mankind in general, but I have given examples of how there have been interventions that are unexplainable, where this person was spared or something intervened to protect this individual. So if that's the case, then one potential theory would be that the phenomenon acts as guardrails for us. We have free will. We're on that river, and this, and you can steer your boat around, but it's the banks. Like it keeps you within certain parameters, and we may deviate from that, predetermined destination. We have the ability to run the ship ashore type scenario.
Yeah.
But it's attempting to keep us flowing in that general direction. Doesn't mean we can't screw it up. But
yes.
That's sort of, I think that's sort of, one potential explanation.
Yeah. And I've used that exact phrase, that there's no reason we can't screw it up. We try hard enough.
Yeah. And, and sometimes you want to do something and things just don't ever seem to work out. And sometimes, you have to step back and wonder, like, maybe that's just not meant to be. Maybe that's not my path.
Right.
It's protecting you. You just don't realize it.
Right. It may not be making you happy.
Yeah.
Because maybe, you want that thing.
It's entirely possible that our happiness is not a factor in that scenario.
You'll get what you need, not what you want.
Right. In like an ant farm scenario, the little kid outside the ant farm has his own objectives, regardless of what the ants might want.
Yeah. That's And I mean,
I know that sounds like we're running astray from the UFO topic, but I think we're actually very much talking about this. That's the complexity of this, is that I think people have been so entrained into viewing this from a very, very narrow perspective.
Yeah.
Like if you're not talking about grays or reptilians, it's not UFOs.
Right. and that's another. So one of the things I was going to say early on in the show is that one of the things I noticed, and other people noticed it, but I had not come across it, was that, like, I'm reading, I think, Transformation from Streiber back in the day, and realizing that my magical practice was resulting in a lot of the same phenomena he was describing, but it didn't look like aliens. And I was like, wait a minute, why is this and this, these experiences are very similar, but they don't look the same. Like, and that was the first hint I think I had where I was like, does this stuff morph based on expectation? Are we, putting our...
That's exactly what I was going to say.
Yeah. Are we putting our energy out there and it's going, okay, well, I have to appear as this because that's what you're putting out there. Is the stuff negative because because we're afraid of it? So we're giving it negative energy to work with, and so it creates something fearsome. And then the more we stop being afraid of it, the less, mean it gets, the less traumatic it gets because we're no longer afraid of it. So the energy it's getting from us is not negative energy anymore.
I kind of view it as intention. In other words, whether it's some type of ritual or it's a religious service or whatever. In other words, I think, or what is a C5 or whatever. In other words, the fundamentally, these are all similar, that you're putting intention into something. And I think that intention is what gleans the results. And the result, like exactly as you said, the results tailor themselves to the format that you placed it in. In other words, you set the parameters. You just, if you're kneeling in a church and you're putting intention to it, it sets the framework for the experience is going to be not only interpreted, it may actually be active. In other words, it may actually manifest itself in a religious context.
Right.
If you are an occultist and you do it, you may get a certain result. If you're a CE5 person, it may manifest itself as a craft in other words, it's a two-way street. In other words, it's not all perception. I think it's active. It's actively morphing it or manifesting itself in a form that is consistent with some level of expectation or something.
Yeah. All right, let's take a quick break. We'll be right back. Quick mid-show break here. Contact info and a recommendation. So contact info, everything can be found at wheredidtheroadgo.com. And you can find every show right back to the very first one in 2013 and tons of other stuff on there. Just take a look around. Links to all our social media, everything from Facebook and X to Reddit and Discord. And an all-new site redesigned by Mr. John Tudor. And the search engine works amazingly well. So if you want to look something up, just pop it in there, and it should be easy enough to find. Of course, you can also leave a donation or become a patron. And you become a patron, it's only $3 a month, and you get extra content with every show, including this one that you're hearing now, where we talked for a very long time on the Patreon segment. So that's something you're going to want to hear. If you don't want to join up, but you just want to purchase the segments, the recent ones are now available to do that with. So, and I will continue doing that. So you could just go buy a single segment if that's all you want to hear and you don't want to actually join up with the Patreon. I will also hopefully be having coffee available, that, as in the website that works like Patreon, where you can donate and get extra content, not actual coffee. But anyway, that's coming up. Also coming up is Alba Twitch. So I plan on being at Alba Twitch Day this year, and that falls, I believe, on the first Saturday of October. Yes, it is Saturday, October 5th. It goes from like 11 a.m. to 5 p.m. Tim Renner will be there. I'm not sure who else is coming out. I'm sure Octavian will probably be there, maybe Chris Ernst. But I plan on being there, so unless something absolutely horrible happens, I should be there for that. And it's always an interesting time, even last year when it rained. If you like heavy music, check out my music show, The Last Exit for the Lost. You will hear stuff that you will not hear anywhere else, that you will not hear on streaming services, that you just can't find access to except through my show. And, or at least, you won't get to know about it through your streaming services. You may be able to find it online. But yes, it's a very underground show with lots of cool music and a lot of exclusive stuff. So if you're looking for your next heavy music fix, check out thelastexit.org. It has all that kind of stuff and a whole archive of shows and stuff. All right, as for recommendations, I'm going to go with a podcast called The Lighthouse, or just Lighthouse. It's on iHeart Podcasts. I'm not sure if that's the same as iHeartRadio. I don't think it is. It was considerably better than I expected. It came out in 2020, and I don't think it went very long. No, it didn't. It only went, I think, one season. But it was a suitably creepy podcast. So if you like that kind of stuff, that might be worth your while. It's a fiction podcast. And I feel like, if I remember right, the last episode was screwed up, at least on my version. I don't know if it downloaded weird or something, but nonetheless, it was still an enjoyable listen. So if you want a short, creepy podcast, Lighthouse. All right, back to the show. So I'm here with Mr. Marty Garza, and we've been talking about only UFOs and nothing else. Because in the end, it all comes back to UFOs, right?
Yeah, it's the one. It's the one topic that keeps on giving.
It's when people ask me what topic am I most interested in, I'm like, probably UFOs, because UFOs I think are the ones that are most directly connected to the core of what this stuff is. I mean, it still may be a ways off, but more so than ghosts or Bigfoot or something like that. I think you get more of a accurate feel from the weirdness of the UFO phenomena than you do some of this other stuff.
Yeah, I very often have people say, so what do you think of this? And, they want answers. And I'm sorry, I can't give you answers. I can just present data. That's all I can do. And sometimes some people are offended because, and I think it's symptomatic of society. People don't want to do the work, right?
No.
A lot of times they want, what is it? Give me an answer. They don't want to run the calculation themselves type thing.
Yeah.
And I think that part of that is because they are so accustomed to being told what to think.
Yes.
And that's just not my style. I'm hesitant to interject my own view of certain things. Or when I do, I'm pretty cautious to say I could be totally wrong.
Oh, sure.
This is just my interpretation. But here's the data and draw your own conclusion. Maybe you can come up with a better scenario than I did. That's from this same data. And I think that by just providing as much and as broad of information as possible, if nothing else, you have more or a better data set to work from, more information to work from to develop a better theory. And if nothing else, I think that we may learn something about ourselves.
Yes.
Even if we never, ever reach a conclusion as to what this thing is that we're dealing with.
And I feel like that's part of its purpose, is to teach us about ourselves. Like when you have indigenous cultures, the people who have these experiences would be the shamans, or whatever name they would use for those, type of people. But we don't have that in our culture.
Yeah, exactly. Instead, we have newscasters that tell us what to think.
and I think to some people, the idea of an unknown is scary, but if you tell them it's aliens, they're okay with that. That fits into the sci-fi view of things or whatever. The same with, cryptids, Bigfoot. Saying it's a hairy ape, it's okay, well, we know what apes are. But saying, oh, this is some weird thing that all this other stuff associated with, they don't like that because there's no neat box, and not having that neat box is scary. And
I think that one of the things that is a hard pill for people to swallow, and it's something that people almost chalk it up to conspiratorial thinking, but it's not. It's just literally, you just have to look into it, is how the narrative has been managed from the very outset. We, for decades, have heard that, the reason that for all the secrecy is early on, because of the War of the Worlds broadcast, there was so much, panic. They just could not reveal the existence of, some non-human intelligence because, it would, the world, society would collapse or something or other. And it doesn't take much looking into that to find out that whole scenario of the suicides and all this stuff that allegedly happened as a result of that broadcast is completely fabricated.
Yeah, yeah.
There have been studies about that. The War of the Worlds broadcast was very small, and it was at the same time, it was only an hour long, I believe, and then it was up against the most popular radio show of the time. So a very, very small percentage of the population was tuned in.
Mm-hmm.
And of those, most knew it was a radio show. Like, they tuned in for it, right? So that whole lore about the panic was manufactured. But I think that, I look at this, I try to like maintain objectivity as much as I can. That's impossible, right? We all have our biases.
Yes, yeah, there's no way to get around that.
Right. I am very conscious of it. And I catch myself, being hypocritical quite often, but I recognize it, and I usually will call attention to it. Like, I'll say, look, I recognize that what I'm saying now completely contradicts what I said 5 minutes ago. It's just, that's the data, right? This is like, that's a feature, not a bug. It's contradictory for a reason, most likely.
Yeah.
So I view, like, if you pay attention at all, and I as much as I'm aware of it, I don't focus on it, but I'm aware of like the constant stream of debates about, whether one individual is telling the truth or the other, or whether they're, it's a psyop, and it, like, in my mind, I perceive it like, have you ever seen the videos of like cats watching tennis?
Yeah.
Their heads are like moving from side to side. It's like, I view like the UFO Twitter type as that. Like, somebody will say something about this individual, and then there'll be a conflicting report, like, oh no, this, they're disinformation agent of this, and then, the heads turn one way, and then the heads turn the other way, and like, and did you ever stop to consider that the information that you're getting on both sides might be coming from the same source?
Right. Yep.
They're just keeping you entertained or distracted. Like, instead of just taking it all as data and not committing to one side or the other, and just sit back and just watch it unfold. Don't take a side, and don't, have to jump in there and like, I believe this guy, or I don't believe this guy. It's like, in the grand scheme, in the 80 years of modern ufology, is this significant? No, not really. I mean, it is in a way, but it generally fits within patterns that happen on a cyclical basis.
Yes, yeah. Going away from that a little bit, I wanted to talk about, Jeremy Vaney's been putting up the Paratopia, as anyone who listens to this show knows, on his Hour on Doing Radio. And he just put up the episode where Jeff gets information from this entity that he calls the Shroud Man. And I knew about this, but I never heard the episode. I knew about it because he talked about it on my show. He encounters this being that seemed to be physical, that was very tall, and would wear a shroud, like a hooded type of shroud. I've encountered beings like this, never in as physical a form as Jeff did, but this is not unique. I mean, this shrouded figure, it floats through history. And do you have any insights on that?
Suffice to say, I know that is a real thing. I have not experienced it myself, but I know people that have. And people that I know are not making it up. They don't even know what it is. They don't even understand. They have no connection to the paranormal in any way, shape, or form. They don't really necessarily care one way or the other. They just know that they have experienced these traumatic things that they don't understand. So totally 100% no, that's a thing.
Okay, but no, you don't have any historical context behind it?
In terms of those type of like apparitions, I mean, they definitely go back throughout history, I believe. They're perceived in different ways. I don't know that I could pin that specific guise. In other words, a hooded figure. And there's all sorts of names for that kind of thing. Shadow beings or Hat Man, and there are a lot of different interpretations of that are somewhat consistent. But historically, they may have been viewed slightly differently. Again, this may be a function of I don't know if it's a societal, like a modern society perception of it, but that apparitions have occurred throughout history. I mean, we know that, to be sure. Of course, they're generally interpreted in a more, I would say, religious context. But part of that is because we have become more secular, as a whole. In other words, I think that people are more inclined to view these type of encounters more from. I'm struggling with the terminology because I want to say paranormal. In other words, like paranormal is a thing that is like acknowledged now.
Yeah.
Where at one time that same exact scenario would have been interpreted in a religious context. Now it's more interpreted in a in quotation marks paranormal type of scenario. So that things have been appearing to people and telling them stories or conveying information, putting images in people's heads, that's throughout history. But the stories seem to be a little different. I think that in terms of the information that's being conveyed, and I think that it's possibly the path of least resistance scenario. I think that it may conform, just like the physical manifestation itself, the message may conform to the mindset of the individual or of society at any given point. Like if you make a comparison with, let's say, the contactee, movements, like the different contactees throughout history. At one time they were told, oh, we're, worried about we're going to blow ourselves up with nuclear weapons and these kind of things. And then more recently, that's morphed into, oh, we're destroying the planet. And or it seems to that other, in more historical bases, those were, oh, you're going to be condemned to hell. Or, in other words, the message seems to morph just like the physical appearance of it seems to morph. And, one argument is like, maybe those are legitimate concerns. Like, maybe there really was a chance that we were going to blow ourselves up, and
I'm sure there was
some form of intervention. And maybe there really is a chance that we could screw the planet. I don't know, but it could also be manipulation.
Yeah. Well, this being the show he just released a few weeks ago is where this being had him take notes, and most of those notes consisted of him trying to explain how he comes from a universe inside of ours that's like inside a particle of our own universe. And it kind of sent Jeff down this whole fractal thing, like fractal existence and how fractals work and all this stuff, and how fractals are found in everything, which is true. I mean, fractals are very interesting. But like also the idea of, having any particle in the universe be a whole nother universe is not the typical type of stuff you get from these beings.
Yes and no. I think that it's difficult to convey the concept of a non-physical existence. In other words, you have to use analogies that are physical. Because our minds are like incapable of like visualizing a non-physical thing. Like it's just the way we're built. So I don't discount that. And the fact that there are messages is another, I think, an interesting part of the phenomenon, that there's this like technology transfer, I would hazard to say, in other words, they're pushing mankind forward. And that, and that kind of raises this relates to something we did mention in the previous segment about the idea that they're coming because they're afraid that, we now have the ability to leave the planet. We've advanced technologically, and we may one day be able to go out into space and create chaos out there. It's like, where did we get the technology from? Like the experiencers claim to be the ones that are, quite a number of them are in the rocket industry. Yeah. Like you're receiving downloads of information on how to build rockets. And then you're going to turn around and say that they're afraid that that's what we're doing. I don't buy that. I think that's way too simplistic. In other words, some intelligence, some advanced intelligence like this, if they had concerns for our ability to do something, they would just stop it. If they had shown the ability to knock out, electrical grids or take out, missile silos and those kind of things, they have the ability to do pretty much whatever they want, whenever they want.
Right.
So why would they be afraid of us? That's not what's going on. That might be what it would appear like on the surface, taken at face value. But the reality is there could be something much deeper going on that we just don't recognize.
Yeah. Again, about 4 different directions that I wanted to go from that. Let's go with, first of all, when you talk about rockets and stuff, you got Parsons right in the middle of that, who was an occultist, who was using magic to help him figure out how to do solid state rockets.
And could remote view.
Yes. So here's something I often wonder, and there's been a couple papers recently that suggest that this may be the case. It may not be possible for us to leave the planet. They're finding that even people on long-term space missions are in danger of developing kidney failure. Like, our bodies seem to need whatever the Earth's field gives us. So if we leave that, we have no idea what the consequences are going to be. Like, they're trying to figure out this whole kidney thing and being like, well, maybe we'll have to put the astronauts on dialysis, you know, when they travel to Mars and stuff. It's like, and you think that's going to be the only issue? You know, like, we haven't gotten outside of the Earth's, like, magnetic field yet.
See, I've run across like that concept, right? The idea that we are limited, that there are all sorts of limitations. And I talked about this. I think we've talked about this before.
Maybe. That,
you know, people will say, oh, you know, it's impossible for us to travel to, you know, outside the solar system because, you know, we'll just never be able to achieve the velocities required, as if that was like the hurdle, right? Oh, you can't, we'll never have superluminal travel. It's like, that's like only the beginning of the hurdles that we could. I mean, how do you navigate superluminally like that? In other words, how do you not run into things like and how do you communicate and how do you come back? And there are massive hurdles to overcome on that kind of thing. But that doesn't mean it's not possible, because imagine 500 years ago or 2,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago saying, I just received a message from the other side of the planet.
Yeah.
They're going to go, that's impossible. Nobody can run that fast. Nobody has a horse that can run that fast. And how are they going to get those horses across the ocean? And it's like, well, if you start with the wrong assumption, in other words, what if that, in other words, thinking of like building faster rockets that's just like evolutionary thinking. That's like, take what we already know and we're just going to step it up by orders of magnitude, right? That doesn't mean that tomorrow we're not going to make a discovery that says, oh, wow, we never thought of it doing it that way. You know, the idea of, at one time they said we will never leave the planet on a rocket will never be able to leave the atmosphere. We'll never travel to the moon because the rocket would be way too heavy to ever lift off the ground. It's going to require so much fuel to get to the moon. It's impossible because no one had ever considered a staged rocket.
Right.
Well, we have fax machines. Right? We've had fax machines forever. And then we developed the 3D printer. And he said, well, if I can send a file to a 3D printer on the other side of the world, it can print out a part that, you know, whereas I don't have to take the part over there. I can literally almost instantaneously send an email with a file that'll print it out over there.
Right.
So when you start thinking out of the box like that, like, okay, well, maybe there's a different way to accomplish the same thing. Just like sending an email, I sent a message to the other side of the world virtually instantaneously, not totally instantaneous, but close. And without having to send a horse or a guy running or whatever. In other words, you start thinking of other ways to tackle the same objective. If this Akashic, record or this information field is out there and we have the ability to access it in some way, that may, in other words, at that point, maybe all bets are off. We can do all sorts of things we thought were impossible.
I guess my question is, are we biologically connected to the planet?
That could be, but that could be sort of like a mechanical view. In other words, mechanically, that's possible. In other words, but I don't know I don't think that necessarily restricts us. Imagine if you had the ability, I'm trying to remember the name of the term. I'll find it here in a second. If you had the ability, like following on the analogy I was just using, right? If you had the ability to send an avatar or create, like literally like 3D print an avatar of yourself to some distant point and then transfer your your consciousness
into it,
drops into it, then you're not really constrained anymore.
That's true.
I know it sounds insane, but it's
no,
not.
It doesn't. It's actually
totally
kind of brilliant.
I believe that if we can imagine it, it will eventually be possible. No matter how far-fetched it might seem, eventually somebody will figure out, even if it's some very like unconventional way of doing it. But I think that almost anything we can think of can actually be achieved.
And I don't argue that. I guess my point was that, like, I think we're going to run into other issues we're not expecting. That it's not going to be the technology that prevents us from leaving the planet, but it might be our biology that causes the issue. And what you're saying, though, would potentially work, having an avatar of some sort
The biology is irrelevant at that point.
Right, exactly. But, like I'm watching all this stuff where we're going to get to Mars in the next 20 years. It's like there may be more problems with that than you think. Like we're just assuming we could just go. And it's just a matter of having the technology to do it. But we're seeing that being in space changes us, changes all kinds of stuff in us. And that's within the Earth's magnetic field, the magnetic field there. Once you leave that, what's going to happen then?
Yeah, that's why I try not to ever say that's impossible. I always try to think of like there's somehow or another, no matter how far-fetched it might seem, somebody will eventually figure it out. And knowledge is like exponential, especially like in words, again, and I keep referring to this, if there's some information field that contains like all the knowledge of the universe. Let's say there are billions of other intelligent life, forms out in the universe or throughout the existence of our universe, it's both time and space, right? All of that, let's say all of that knowledge is like in some like data bank, effectively, virtual data bank. And if we figured out some way to crack that, and all of a sudden we have access to all of this information, I think at that point, all bets are off. Things that were effectively magic are now like easily achievable. And we're no longer constrained physically. Like that's like it's like the leash is off and now we can do things. At that point, you also, I guess you could say you could argue that you're effectively eternal at that point as well.
Yeah. Well, also, would it ruin everything to know everything?
Yeah. Part of the mechanism may be that we have to
learn it,
walk the path to learn these things, right? And maybe that's the preparation. Maybe that you can't get hit by all that knowledge all at once. You have to work towards it. And there's this thing that I found the name of it. It's called the Schwinger effect, and it's the ability to create matter from electrical fields. So effectively, like you're creating matter from nothing.
I have.
So in other words, in the analogy of the 3D printer, you don't necessarily have to have. In other words, following this, like I could see I'd say millions of years. It may not even take that long. It could be 100 years for all we know, but. Eventually, I could see that exploiting this effect, you could theoretically create a physical manifestation in exactly the way you would use a 3D printer. Only you're doing it, and maybe this, since we're talking about electric fields and stuff, it may not be limited by time or space.
Was that a fairly recent paper that talks about that?
They achieved it, I guess, in 2022, but the concept actually, let me think here. I know we discussed this. It goes back to like the 50s when they started working on it.
Okay.
Let me see here.
Whitley Streiber in one of his books proposed the idea of quantum entanglement to be used to communicate across like the universe. Because
that's sort of what this is somewhat like. And this was Fritz Sauter, Werner Heisenberg, and Hans Heinrich Euler started working on this in 1951.
Wow.
And they cracked it in 2022, or the first, execution of it. So again, jump forward 100 years or 1,000 years, and someday, eventually, you may be able to effectively manifest a physical object somewhere out of nowhere, out of nothing.
You wouldn't have to fly to Mars. You could basically teleport to Mars. You just need the machine to create the matter.
Right. Instead of, again, like what I'm trying to think of the term, the idea of sending these self-replicating robots into space that could travel indefinitely, you wouldn't have to do that. You just of course there still, even then there are still hurdles. Not only would you have to achieve the capability to do this, but you have to have the ability to direct it. Like, how do you locate that distant place that you can't see?
Yeah.
How do you? It's still extraordinarily complex, but I don't know that it's out of the realm of possibility. In other words, I think that if we can envision it, eventually somebody will figure out a way.
Yeah, it just may not be the way we think about it.
Exactly.
So we're out of time, but if you don't mind sticking around for a Patreon, we can continue talking a bit.
Absolutely.
And where can people find you, Marty?
I keep a low profile, but generally my residence is on the Discord, on the Brothers of the Serpent Discord. And of course, I can be found on episodes on Brothers of the Serpent that we do. We have our UFO series on there that we do periodically, and I don't know, we're 13, 14 episodes in, I believe.
Okay, that's what I was going to ask you, how many you've done total.
Yeah, I've actually done like 20-some episodes, but in the series, I believe we're on episode 13. Occasionally we'll do like one-offs, but the series is a pretty, deep dive into like very esoteric aspects of the phenomenon.
Yes. Yeah.
Much like our discussion tonight.
they are must-listen episodes. You have such a great collection of data there. So
thank you very much. It means a lot coming from you.
All right. Thank you, Marty.
Thank you, everyone.
All right. I'd like to take a moment here to thank all of my Patreons for their support. Without you, this show would not be possible. And I want to give a shout out to those of you pledging $10 or more. Greg Ross, John Blackburn, Madeline J., Matt in Delaware, Allison Cook, Super Inframan, 36 Dingo, Tim, Andrew Nichols, Matthew Sproul, Marthartha, Midnight Review Presents, Christine, a blue second-gen MR2 drifting around a Japanese mountain, Patricia Giaquinta, American Rambler, Andrew Maines, Ann Witowski, Barbara Fisher, Beverly Williamson, Illuminati, Bright Rectangle, Charles Davis, Charles in Florida, Land of the Crazy and Communicable, Corey Nelson, Craig Parmenter, Diane B., MTK, Eric Citron, Eric Todd, History and Coffee, J. Otto Bullitt, Jack Huntington, James Lindsay, Jim and Sophie, John Mattingly, John Bracken, Carla Mahoney, Kevin Schreck, Cool Kitty, Kristen L., Laser Printer Jam, Lauren McLean, Linda, Linz Jackson K., MJ Armstrong, Mark Brady, Sasha McHale, No One, Oli Andre Olar, Paul Jeffries, Perry Peters, Philosopher of Mirrors, Riker and Stark, Ron Dupre, Sam Sharon, Sarah Horgan, Stacy Sherwood, Stevie Norman, Strange Stories with the Seeker and Skeptic podcast, Tactical Therapist, Taylor Bell, The Esoteric Book Club podcast, Thunderboy, Tyler Glimstead, Varosh K., Victoria, Vincent Trewell, Will Gebhard, Will Powell, Ren Collier, Annabelle Smith, Caroline Walker, TDT Skunkworks, Matthew Brown, Colin Karras, and Craig Sagastumi. Thank you all so very much for the support. All right, I hope you enjoyed that conversation, and definitely check out the Brothers of the Serpent podcast. The podcast itself is great, and the episodes with Marty are fantastic, and there's a lot of them, and they're long, so if you haven't listened to them, they're well worth your time. There's also another over an hour Patreon segment with Marty for this show that Patreons will be getting fairly soon. So if you want to become a patron, you can just go to wheredidtheroadgo.com, click on the big Patreon link, and it's only $3 a month. You can also buy individual Patreon segments if you don't care about joining up as a patron where you pay every month and just want a particular Patreon segment. You can do that there too. You can also, if you click on collections, I think it'll show up. You can check out the documentary. You can just get it right off the Patreon. If you're a Patreon, you will get access to the documentary. But if you just want to watch the documentary on Where Did the Road Go, which is called Magicians Along to Sea, which was done by Christopher Ernst, that is available on Patreon now. So you can just click on it and buy it, and there you go. Hopefully, at some point, it'll also be available on Amazon. Again, October 5th is Albert Switch Day. I will be there. I may have some stuff with me. I don't know yet. I never have anything to sell at these things, but I was talking to Matt Festa about something maybe to do with the book cover of my upcoming autobiography, which I really wanted to have done by now, but it's not. And it'll be done when it's done, I guess. I want to make sure it's well done when I put it out. And hopefully people will still care. But anyway, he's done an amazing cover, so I may be selling prints of that cover at Albatwitch. And again, Tim Renner will be there. Octavian should be there, and maybe Chris Ernst, because he's not that far away, so unless he doesn't have anything else, I assume he'll be stopping by. So yeah, come hang out with us. Check out the newly designed website, wheredidtheroadgo.com, done by John Shooter. Amazing job, and everything works beautifully. If you find something that doesn't, though, let us know, and I'll see you next time. You have been listening to Where Did the Road Go? This show is made possible in part from our Patreons, and we thank you and everyone listening for helping us continue this exploration of the strange. You can always find everything Where Did the Road Go related at www.wheredidtheroadgo.com. And thank you so much for your support.